A make-or-break moment for the tar sands industry and the fight against global warming. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. Just days after publicly reaffirming his belief in the threat posed by climate change, Barack Obama is under pressure to prove he means it. What's billed as the largest climate rally in history is being planned for Sunday in Washington, D.C. The specific goal is to ensure President Obama rejects the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, which would pump tar sands oil from Alberta in Canada to Texas. It's the latest action in a long-running campaign. Just this week, 50 people were arrested while demonstrating against the pipeline outside the White House. It's an issue that has the potential to alienate a significant section of the president's base. But Mr. Obama is also under pressure from Congress and his own party to approve the project. Last month, a bipartisan majority in the Senate urged approval after what it described as an exhaustive environmental review. The senators concluded it was in the U.S. national interest to build the 2,500-kilometer pipeline, arguing it would cut dependence on foreign oil and create jobs. Opponents point out that the extraction of Alberta tar sands oil will mean irrevocable damage to the environment. Game over for the planet, in NASA scientists James Hansen's words. In addition, they point to the likelihood of the pipeline leaking its particularly toxic combination of chemicals in areas of huge significance for the environment and the U.S.'s water supply. In fact, both environmental campaigners and the energy industry say President Obama's decision is a crucial moment for the future of tar sands exploitation. A yes will entrench the fuel as a major source of energy. A no render it too unprofitable to be worthwhile to big oil. So is the president's environmental legacy at stake? Joining us now is climate change activist Bill McKibben. He was among those arrested outside of the White House on Wednesday. From New Jersey, we have climate scientist Alan Robock. And here in the studio, Charles Ebinger, the director of the Energy Security Initiative at the Brookings Institution. Bill McKibben, first of all, there appear to be two arguments against construction of the Keystone, two main arguments. First, the near certainty of some sort of leak, and how, given the volume and the type of oil, the potential for catastrophe. But then also, whether a president of the United States who says he believes in climate science can plausibly then go ahead and and say, okay, well, the future lies in tar sands extraction. Let's begin with the first one, though. Bill, when it comes to the construction of the pipeline, what specifically concerns you?
Well, the first Keystone pipeline, the one before this, managed to leak 12 times in its first year of operation. They're running this through new ground over the Oglala Aquifer out there in Nebraska. So people there are rightly concerned. There were a bunch of ranchers who showed up on Wednesday to get arrested here in D.C., and that was the message they were bringing. The bigger question in the long run is the second one you raise. Let's assume that it makes it all that way down the pipeline without spilling. Then it spills into the atmosphere. All that carbon adds to the load that we're already putting on the planet. And coming after the year in which we pretty conclusively melted the Arctic, that would be folly on a whole new scale.
All right, well, let's deal with that first argument first, because it is a major part of the argument to build the pipeline for many as well. Let's first take a quick look at the route of the proposed pipeline. It's to carry tar sands oil from Hardisty in Canada to the U.S. refining hub of Port Arthur in Texas. The route crosses the Oglala Aquifer, the main source of water for the U.S.'s agricultural heartland. The initial route passed through the environmentally sensitive Sand Hills region in the state of Nebraska, and many, including the state's Republican governor, opposed that plan. But the new route avoids the boundaries of the Sandhills, and the state accepts TransCanada's argument that water supplies will be safe. But opponents point out that the pipeline still crosses the aquifer and also cuts through other areas ecologically similar to the Sandhills. Charles Ebinger, doesn't any of that worry you?
It does. Of course, it worries one. Any pipeline can have an accident. But if one looks at all the pipelines in the country that cross the Oglala Reservoir, for many, many years, both oil and natural gas pipelines, I think without great environmental havoc occurring, On balance, I think it makes sense to approve the pipeline, get that oil into the world market, because we just have had a number of forecasts come out in the last few weeks from British Petroleum and Exxon showing that the world is going to need another 16 million barrels a day of oil between now and 2030. This comes from a loyal ally of the United States, our largest and most reliable trading partner. And I think to reject the pipeline at this point would be very injurious to our foreign relations.
Professor, sorry, you wanted to come in.
What the U.S. needs is energy. It doesn't need oil.
That's right.
You can get energy from other sources. For an oil company to say that we need oil makes me a little curious about the reasons that they're saying that. I agree with Bill that the main damage from this is symbolic. It's symbolic that we're going to continue to burn fossil fuels and use the atmosphere as a sewer with no charge to put more carbon dioxide in there, which will last for thousands of years.
Charles?
I would only point out that we are using more fossil fuels. The world is using more fossil fuels. We've seen tremendous opportunities afforded by the shale gas revolution, where we've actually been able to back out some dirtier coal from a CO2 perspective and actually reduce our CO2 emissions. Of course, we have to be concerned about burning fossil fuels as cleanly as possible, but this is why I think down the road we need to prove on gas and coal that we can sequester CO2 both commercially and technically in a viable manner, and we need to use oil as safely as possible. But we can't look at this as a purely domestic political issue. We live in a global energy environment, and these resources of the oil sands are a critical component of that. The whole debate we've been having in recent years about trying to free up our dependence on foreign oil is predicated on oil sands and tight oil in the lower 48.
And that is a bit perplexing there. I mean, is the suggestion that the US is going to nationalize the oil companies? I mean, this is all for export, this oil, isn't it?
Some will be exported, some will be used domestically. Even if the Keystone
This is foreign oil. This is from Canada.
Well, Canada has been a loyal trading partner, and this idea that's come out recently that we're not going to be importing any oil in a few years is predicated on a large volume of oil sands coming into the country. We are not going to give up Canadian imports as part of our energy program.
You know,
Look, in the big scheme of things, the problem is global warming.
That's
and
right.
the main cause of global warming is carbon dioxide.
So, Alan,
I just came from a seminar here at Rutgers on wind energy by Christina Archer. There's enough wind energy to power the entire planet many, many times over. We just need to build the wind power and build the transmission.
So
There's enough solar power
Alan's really right.
to power the whole world.
Bill McKibben.
Charles is...
The reason that people want to use fossil fuels is because they're too cheap. And so it's a question of politics, it's a question of government to put a gradually increasing carbon tax so people will not want to use the fossil.
All right, Professor, hold on for a second, Bill.
So I think Alan's exactly right. Charles is solving the problems of the last century, this problem about energy independence and things that we talked about for a long time. The far greater problem, indeed the biggest problem that human beings have ever faced by a large order of magnitude, is what we're now doing to the basic life support systems of this Earth. Last summer, as I said, we melted the Arctic. That is, we took one of the largest 4 or 5 physical features on Earth and we broke it. The oceans are now 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. We just came through the hottest year in American history by a full degree. We watched, talk about national security, we watched a drought so deep that the price of food around the world went up 10, 20, 30, 40%. These are the questions that really, not the ones we've been working on for decades.
How we get there. It's interesting, we interviewed somebody who is the CEO of a solar energy, a renewable trade association. And he seemed to be suggesting, though, that even though the science does point to catastrophic change, perhaps the environmental movement needs to have a bit more pragmatism in how it views fossil fuels. The fossil fuels will still be part of that transition to renewable energy. Here's a portion of that interview.
I think natural gas and renewables actually complement each other very nice. I mean, in the sense of solar, we are a variable technology, which means we generate electricity when the sun is out and not as much, obviously, in the shoulder hours or in the evening. That's where natural gas plays a perfect compatibility role to support our electricity generation by generating at night. And so I think that as we move to a lower carbon economy, there's a role for natural gas and renewables to be combined to provide a cleaner, reliable energy source for the 21st century.
Right, but the problem is natural gas isn't a clean, renewable source of energy. It's a dirty source of energy, both in extraction and usage. It doesn't seem to be compatible with fighting the challenge we have from climate change.
Well, remember, we're transitioning from an economy that was based primarily on coal. Just 4 years ago, 52% of our electricity came from coal. So as we transition from, really the dirtiest sources of fossil energy towards clean renewables, we're going to need to have that bridge, and natural gas provides that bridge to help transition over to a fully 100% carbon-free technology.
How long a bridge?
It's probably going to be a long bridge, but in large part because we need to scale up the amount of manufacturing that exists for solar, wind, and other technologies, continue to lower the cost, remove some of the market barriers that exist both with utilities at the state level as well as some of the federal barriers, but ultimately make investment in our new infrastructure that is cleaner, smarter, and more reliable.
Well, the problem with all this is you're looking at business models. We're facing a climate emergency. We have no time for a market mechanism. Something has to be done now, and frankly, ramping up natural gas is only going to add to the problem right now. So, I mean, do you think this is an emergency or simply a business opportunity for you?
Well, I do think it's an emergency, but I do think there needs to be a business solution. So if we level the playing field, extend some of the policies that support solar and wind and other technologies permanently and create an environment that attracts investment, I think that transition will happen much faster than people expect. But to your point, this is a crisis, and we need to make sure that we are putting these policies in place immediately. And if Congress is unwilling to do it, then certainly President Obama needs to step up and make sure that those policies are in place.
I would wholly endorse that point of view. And I would also put on the table, if we're talking about non-CO2 emitting sources, we should be looking at small-scale modular nuclear reactors for the future, although a lot of people in the environmental community are opposed to that. The problem with renewables is not that they aren't growing fast and hopefully can grow faster, but they have to be scaled up at the size of the global energy demand base if you look over the next 30 years.
All right, Bill McKibben, what do you make of that?
First of all, I mean, great interview, but sort of off the point because there's no natural gas coming down that pipeline.
It's because
the dirtiest oil on earth.
We moved away from Keystone pretty rapidly. We're going to return to it, but this is just a side point that seemed to present itself.
More to the point, as usual, you really want to be up to date on this stuff, okay? So not talking 10, 15 years ago. 2 weeks ago, the University of Delaware put out a study saying they did 28 billion computer simulations of all the weather conditions that we face, and they said by 2030, we could be doing 99.9% of our electricity, even scaled up to provide electric vehicles, on this continent from sun and wind. What it takes is commitment to do that, and commitment to do that is exactly what we won't get if we put in a 40-year lifetime pipeline to suck the dirtiest oil on earth out of Alberta.
And thank you for segueing back into
That's
Keystone.
right, and when it comes to nuclear, there are no such safe small nuclear plants. There's many reasons why nuclear is not the answer, including that we don't know what to do with the waste, that the emission of radioactive materials with routine operation, the chance of terrorist attacks, the usage of it for making nuclear weapons, the cost. We can do it without nuclear. We can do it with solar and wind. Christina Archer from the University of Delaware was just here talking to us about wind. I'm surrounded by solar farms here at Rutgers, just outside the door. Most of this campus is powered by solar. So with incentives, we can do it now. We don't have to wait, and we should start on that path rather than building more of an infrastructure for burning fossil fuels.
All right, well, let's return now wholeheartedly back to Keystone then. I mean, that was a bit of a diversion. As far as the arguments for construction are concerned, another is that it will provide an economic boom, and that's another interesting, an important point, especially in a time of economic crisis. In fact, we spoke to Dave Molina. He's from a construction union, and this is what he had to say.
The Keystone XL pipeline will create thousands of jobs for our union members and members of a number of other construction craft unions. It's a much needed project to deliver the oil from the Canadian oil sands down into the American market, and we think it's good for the economy. Obviously, it's good for workers, and that's the reason why we're supporting the pipeline.
Can you see why some argue, though, especially those who are concerned about the fate of the planet, that this isn't just any old project? This project has a huge impact beyond creating jobs in the short term.
Well, frankly, we believe that this oil is going to be brought to market one way or the other. And the fact is that this pipeline will be the safest pipeline ever built. It will be bringing a resource down through the safest method of shipment, much safer than bringing it down by other methods. And whether it comes down through the United States through other methods or goes west to ports to go overseas, this oil is coming out of the ground. We believe that the pipeline provides the best economic benefit for the American workers in the United States.
Now, Bill McKibben, that's an argument we hear from the left and right, then, actually.
That's right.
If those people
Two
were
things.
building,
Just a moment,
building
Professor.
solar
Two
arrays,
things here. First is, yes, you can't build a pipeline without construction jobs, and that's nothing to sneeze at. On the other hand, the real jobs bonanza lies when we decide that we're going to go straight to renewable energy, as Professor Bocock's saying. I mean, you know, no one's going to put their house on a boat and send it to China to get solar panels on top. Second thing, lots of unions now coming out opposed to this pipeline. The National Nurses Union last week did it basically because they said, we're tired of treating people for asthma, you know, that we need no more fossil fuel. The real thing to get across, the one point that's really been missed in this debate is that one hears over and over again, is this oil is coming out of the ground anyway. It's not. Canadian government had said, we're going to build a pipeline west of the Pacific. By all accounts, that pipeline is now stopped. The protest that rose against it in British Columbia and among First Nations people across Canada has absolutely stopped it cold. The financial press in Canada the last few weeks has been clear that without Keystone, the expansion of the tar sands is a dead letter. Well, they talked about running a pipeline through New England to get it to Portland, Maine. Let me just tell you, we had 1,400 people on a bitter cold morning in Portland protesting 2 weeks ago. If they're having trouble getting it through Nebraska and Oklahoma, I can pretty well guarantee you there's not going to be a pipeline through Vermont and Maine.
Something we haven't completely tied down yet, unfortunately, Professor, but perhaps you can do this now in a very brief summary. How destructive is this particular form of oil to the environment?
Well, when you burn it, it produces carbon dioxide, just like burning any other fossil fuel. And it's the same. I'm not familiar with the details of the chemistry of this particular oil. I'm talking about on a global basis. The total amount of oil that would be burnt from this would not be a large fraction of what's being burnt, but it would be a significant fraction. And people say, well, therefore, let's not worry about it. But every little source of fossil fuel is small, and you add them all up. So you have to limit each one.
Let me rephrase that.
So,
Bill McKibben.
I can answer.
Bill McKibben. Something perhaps we haven't entirely nailed down yet is why there's a particular concern about this form.
So two reasons. One, this stuff is really dirty. It's not like, this is not oil where you stick a drill in the ground and, you know, up comes the bubbling crude. This is mixed with sand in this formation called bitumen. It's disgusting. And to get at it, you have to heat it. You have to burn a huge amount of natural gas in order to heat it up enough to flow. So in greenhouse terms, it becomes particularly carbon intensive. But the second thing is, there's so much of it. The NASA team calculated last year that if you could torch off all the oil in Alberta tonight, which thank God you probably can't, but if you could, all the recoverable oil, you'd run the planet's CO2 concentration from 390 parts per million to 540 parts per million. It's not like this is the only thing we have to block. There are huge coal mines in Australia and in the Powder River Basin. There are other huge formations. But we're now at the point, I mean, I hate to keep saying this, but the Arctic melted last summer. We're now at the point where we have to stop doing all this new stuff, and we have to get off the ones we're using now as quickly as we can.
Charles Ebinger, I mean, would you agree that this makes notions of energy security, whatever that definition actually is indeed, completely irrelevant then if we're looking at
I would not agree with that one iota. I think this oil can be used safely. And in point of fact, according to a study by IHS-CERA, a leading consultancy, it's about 5 to 6% worse than some of the oil we burn offshore California today. And coming back to your point about the pipeline, I would slightly disagree with Bill. He's absolutely right. There's a lot of environmental opposition to a Western Canadian pipeline. But this government in Canada is very nationalistic. It was appalled by the president's decision. It will find a way to build that pipeline. And ironically, if that pipeline is built, it not only will go to China and elsewhere in Asia, but there will be quite a big market for that oil in California. So we're going to burn the oil in California once that pipeline is built rather than in the Gulf Coast.
You're alone in thinking this.
you're
The Globe and Mail last
that
week
there
said this pipeline to the west is not going to be built in any foreseeable future, that without Keystone they're going to be shutting down the, expansion plans for the tar sands. This is their lifeline, and that means that it's Barack Obama's great legacy. Think about it. If he says no here, it'll be the first time that any world leader has said, I'm not going to build an important piece of infrastructure because I'm actually concerned enough about the climate to say no. That'll be a legacy for him. It'll also be a way that we can now start talking to the rest of the world and say, look, we're beginning to make some changes here. We need you guys to make some changes too. The problem here is, yeah, Charles is right. Political reality pushes us in one direction. There's trillions of dollars of oil up there. But reality, physics points us in the other direction. And in the end, reality trumps political reality, hard as that is.
If this is the case, then the president
And
ought to push for a carbon tax.
Your assumption.
He ought to push for a carbon tax.
Just a moment, Professor. We'll come to you in just a second.
He ought to push for a carbon tax, not announce in the State of the Union address that he's going to accelerate oil and gas production on federal lands. That's going to release CO2.
Well, that's the point,
president
I
is
suppose.
very
Yes.
pragmatic, and he realizes we need all of the above, including the renewables that these gentlemen have been talking about. But we can't do it without all of them.
We'll get to presidential compromises in a moment. Professor, they do come in.
I just wanted to say that your assumption about people in California burning this oil depend on carbon tax, like you just mentioned. Yes, we do need a gradually increasing carbon tax so that the other sources of energy become competitive with fossil fuels. I was just in Europe. Gas costs twice as much per gallon as it does there, and they don't drive SUVs. They can't afford it. So they have much better public transportation. So we can live our life using much less energy. If we move to energy efficiency rather than just making all sources available.
We're running out of time.
That's
Bill
part of the
McKibben,
solution too.
another argument that is made that you can build Keystone, but actually you can offset the particular damage of tar sands oil by having stricter emission standards on new and existing power stations. In fact, some people wonder whether actually that's what President Obama will end up announcing. It's his usual kind of give and take away.
Yeah, half a loaf here.
Exactly.
We're not at a point where half a loaf makes sense anymore. If we're going to do anything about, and when we talk about legacy, I mean, let's be real here. 50 years from now, when people look back at our time, no one is going to care about the fiscal cliff or the sequester. They're going to say, the temperature started rising through the roof, and what did you guys do? This is the easiest of calls, the Keystone one, the purest of tests. All we have to do is say no to building some new thing that's going to send oil overseas anyway. This is the absolute chance to begin turning around this great juggernaut, which you've got to turn around someday. Yeah, we should have a carbon tax. I was on Capitol Hill yesterday helping Barbara Boxer and Bernie Sanders introduce a bill that would put one on. But we're not going to get one through the Congress anytime soon. This is something the president can actually do now instead of just the kind of idle talk that people keep making.
Charles Ebinger, when you look at energy security, I mean, how far is climate change a part of our potential energy insecurity in your
It's a vital part. I don't disagree with any of the things the gentleman have as to the nature of the threat. I'm just saying the world is not going to change overnight. Most Americans don't want to pay the kind of high gasoline prices, electricity prices they pay in Europe. If we change that as a society, well to the good. But in the interim, we need to develop all these resources and burn them as cleanly as possible, put on more energy efficiency, as one of our guests said. But there's no way you're going to scale up renewables in the next 20 years to meet the world's energy needs. There is not a major energy company in the world that would endorse that view.
20 seconds, Bill McKibben.
Yeah, there's definitely not a major energy company in the world that would endorse it because they're making
Renewables
money hand
also.
over fist doing what they're doing now. What we have to make sure is that the fossil fuel industry becomes the energy industry and goes to work on renewables. We'll do that when we stop putting stupid things like Keystone forward.
Bill McKibben, thank you very much. Professor Alan Robock, thank you. Charles Ebinger, thank you as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.